Go ahead. Any other questions? Or did I answer yours? Go ahead back there.
Who owns the Federal Reserve?
Technically, it's owned by the member banks of the Federal Reserve System. That's what they issue stocks, and they buy that stock, and technically they own it. Now, if you really wanted to go into who owned all the stock in those banks, I suppose you could call them the actual owners. But on the actual books, and I have a list of all the banks that own stock in the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and Cleveland, Ohio. It turns out my brother used to be a school teacher for several years, and it turned out he had a student that got quite successful in Lemon, South Dakota, and got selected to be on the Federal Reserve Board in Minneapolis here. And I was trying to get that information just to see it, and I couldn't do it, so he went and asked his student if he has any chance he could get it, if he was on the board, and he said, sure. Next time I go down to Minneapolis to a meeting, I'll bring all that stuff home to you. And he did. And he sent it to me, and it's not really anything as far as me, it just names all the banks. But, you know, it's not really who owns, it's who gets the benefit. And we clearly see who gets the benefit, the whole financial system. Who gets the big bonuses at the top of these big financial companies? I think that shows who gets the benefit, and that's really, it's not who owns it, it's who gets the benefit. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Each Federal Reserve Bank has shareholders, though?
Each one of them. Each one of the 12 has their own shareholders. They each have a district, and then like Minneapolis, it goes to Wyoming, Montana, South Dakota, I think Wisconsin and Michigan, but I'm not sure about Michigan. I'd have to look that up. And then they each there have their own banks. And I used to have the 4 banks who actually first chartered the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Used to have them. There was one in Minnesota and one in South Dakota and one in North Dakota and one in Montana, I think. But now I can't tell you those right off the top of my head. You got a question?
I'm trying to understand how banks, like Wachovia, get themselves into trouble. Is it?
That's simple.
Yeah.
Because remember now, as I told you, when they create this money, it's out there. And of course, if I pay this back, it comes out of here like this, doesn't it? And if I had 110, then 10 would go up here to the profit of the bank. And then this would go over here. And then 1,000 wipes out 1,000, so you get 0, and 1,000 wipes out of 0 and gets this, right? Okay, so now if I didn't pay this, there is a ruling in the banking system, and I don't think it's any law. And I personally don't believe the big banks say that I never pay that back. Then, according to that rule and set by the banking system, whoever said it, says that now the banks have to write that law off out of this account. Yes, out of their profit. So if they haven't gained enough interest to offset this, if they haven't got that much interest, at least they can't offset this, and they're out of business. And I personally can't prove it, but believe it, I don't think the 3-4 biggest banks have to go by that rule. And I assure you this is no law, it's just a ruling in the banking system, that's the way they have to operate. And that's what your bank examiners and stuff go in to check. When the bank gets examined, and we'll take the state banks of Minnesota, they are not regulated in any way by the Federal Reserve System, only by the state system. In fact, actually, the legislators in this department, in the legislature, actually can put any regulation they want on the banking system. I personally attended less than a month ago. Linda Scheid, the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, had a hearing where she called in the FDIC and the state banking officials and all that, and the Fed didn't show up. And of course, there's no reason for it. But it was very clear, listening to that meeting, that those legislators could put any regulations they wanted on those banks. Or they could remove any they wanted to. And of course, like I said, if this borrower doesn't pay any of it back, say that I go out and spend all this, I had a high time on the night or whatever, and I don't have it. Well, they can't take it from me because I didn't even buy anything with it that they could take. Wine and song. And, then what do? I eat it. It's gone. Drink it. They can't do anything. They can't put me in debtor's prison anymore. So they got to suffer the loss. If they don't have enough there to offset it, they're in trouble. That's how banks go broke.
Which makes them, that's where the insolvent
Yeah.
comes in.
Yeah. And then I didn't know this until I went to that hearing. If a bank goes down, the FDIC actually pays another bank to pick them up. They actually pay them. I always thought this bank bought that one out. That's the terminology they use. I mean, they bought out this other bank. But I found out at that meeting there that that's not true. That the FDIC that insures these banks actually pays another bank to buy them out. And it basically pays them on how many bad debts they have to have. So basically they bail them out, and then they just switch ownership. And now this bank's probably got the same good customers over here, and the bad customers, they got wiped out.
But if they just created that money out of nothing, what is there to pay back?
Numbers. The numbers exist. And I agree they created it out of thin air, and there is nothing to pay back.
You already drank up your money, and now that bank got that on their book.
That's right. They just got a bad loss.
They can't get back.
That's right.
So they have to write it off, and you say the only way they can write it off is from their
That's right.
profits.
From their profit income.
Well, as the system unwinds backwards during a crisis, Main Street banks go down, and this would eventually work towards the center of the system. Would regional Federal Reserve banks go down, and then ultimately the Federal Reserve itself?
I don't think so, because the reason I say that, I personally, and I can't prove this is just something I've been really putting a lot of thought in, and a lot of it is, what would I do if I was running this system? And I think a lot about that. In fact, maybe this is what helped me understand it, because when I was really young, have you ever watched Bonanza and Big Valley on TV? I could see myself doing that. I mean, I had great visions. I was going to have a son every 6 years. Really works out well. Because by the time the first one goes, the second one's a really good worker, and by the time he goes, the third one's ready. By the time he's done, one of the older ones comes in and takes over the place, see? Didn't work out that way. My wife quit with 2 sons. They was 6 years apart. And I had a vision that one to be a lawyer and one to be a banker. It turned out they both became bankers, not lawyers. They wasn't interested in the ranch. Well, actually, I lost the ranch, and that's a whole story that I'll tell you some other time. You really don't need it today. But if you invite me back a time or two someday, I'll just spend the day talking about how I went from $1 million to nothing in one day. But that, I'm not going to get into that today. And having thought about this a lot and thinking about what I would do if I was running it. And I know from a personal study, and it's in that book, Modern Money Secret, some of the bigger banks, the biggest ones, still run on the same charter that Alexander Hamilton established in 1786, I think. Now, don't hold me to that exact date exactly without looking it up. Well, if they're running on this same charter and they've been able to weather all these things, I have a sneaking suspicion they don't play quite with the same rules that these other people do. And I know for a fact that if I wanted to eliminate some of my competition in banking, because new banks spring up every once in a while in good times, I would have a little rule in here that I could pull back the money supply and I could wipe them out. And they couldn't touch me. That would ensure I always stayed on top, wouldn't it? And if I was doing this, I would do it that way. I wouldn't want to put in a rule that would wipe me out.